Eye to eye, once sworn enemies, the Taliban and the British cooperate to get people out of Afghanistan. At Kabul airport, those lucky enough to get through checkpoints make it onto planes and to safety.
Young members of our armed forces and soldiers from other Western nations have to make that dreadful decision, that choice between who can go and who can stay.
But not everyone. We show the Armed Forces Minister the footage our team filmed in Kabul of those still stranded.
Those scenes are desperate. I have every sympathy for UK passport holders who are despairing in the crowd.
Taliban forces have ruled out any extension to foreign troops remaining in Afghanistan beyond the end of August. The British government says there are just hours to rescue those remaining. Also on the programme. A crackdown on COVID test cowboys, but it's too late for many of us who've already been abroad. And the return of a 300-year-old tradition, the first changing of the guard since before the pandemic.
This is the ITV Evening News with Lucrezia Millarini.
Good evening. At Kabul airport, as the evacuation deadline gets closer, British paratroopers are tonight cooperating with their once sworn enemies, the Taliban, to get as many people out as they can. Those lucky enough to have the right paperwork pass from watchful Taliban soldiers to the British troops who are the gatekeepers of their rescue. But Afghans so desperate to leave only have till the end of this month to do so. And the Taliban today seem to rule out as a red line any extension that would mean British or American troops staying on. While Kabul airport may be calmer, the sense of life or death urgency is unmistakable, as our senior international correspondent John Irvine reports from there.
The Taliban think they're doing well, facilitating the evacuation of Afghans too terrified of them to stay in this country. These people have waited days to leave Taliban-held Kabul by getting beyond these containers into the UK compound that is the staging post for Britain's exit and for that of as many former Afghan employees and their families as possible. Conditions are grim, but everything is relative. 2 days ago, 7 people died in the melee. Now the misery here is much more organised. The Taliban commander in charge is senior, an emir in their hierarchy. He told me they were doing their best, making it up as they go along. He said they'd been busy fighting over the last 20 years and didn't have any experience when it came to crowd control. Would-be evacuees go through several filters. To reach this point, they had to convince the Taliban they have the right paperwork to flee. Then they wait to be called forward by an interpreter working with the British. And this is the passageway to salvation, a narrow corridor created by placing a container feet from the airport wall. At the end, 2 members of the parachute regiment are in charge of admissions. When they get through, the final gauntlet is a question and answer session and a look at the paperwork to see if asylum really has been granted and safe passage out of here is theirs. So this is the awful point where young members of our armed forces and soldiers from other Western nations have to make that dreadful decision, that choice between who can go and who can stay. Things may look calm, but it felt raw and visceral. These Afghans believe this selection process is about life and death. It's challenging work for our paras, not least because of the close proximity of an enemy some fought in Helmand, losing comrades along the way. Who and what we were able to film, who we were able to speak to, required Taliban approval. The Afghans granted safe passage, were leaving all that behind. They would soon be boarding one of these giant military transports to take them anywhere but here. The tempo of flights picked up today as the world answered the call. The British and the Americans, Italians, Canadians, Germans, Hungarians, Australians and New Zealanders were among those we watched, taking people to the freedom guaranteed beyond. The threat of ground fire meant some of the planes were doing nosedive landings and then taking off, standing on their tails as they made steep climbs to the safety of altitude. The combat manoeuvres that some of the pilots are using to get in and out of here are known in the business as K-SANS, after the infamous siege during the Vietnam War. The White House doesn't like Vietnam analogies for obvious reasons, but as was the case in Saigon, the Americans will inevitably leave friends behind here, and so will the British. As we left the entrance to the UK's last post in this country, many Afghans continue to wait in the hope of reaching it, despite the indignity and hardship of doing so. John Irvine, ITV News, Kabul.
It is, as we've been hearing, a race against time to airlift to safety the translators and other Afghan staff who helped the British effort in Afghanistan. The plight of those that are stranded there, fearing for their lives should they be left behind, is reflected by the desperate helplessness felt by families and friends here. For some hiding from the Taliban, even the journey to Kabul airport is now too terrifying to face. Dan Rivers reports.
This is what faces former British interpreters stranded in Kabul when they try to get to the airport. Taliban fighters have tightened security on key roads around the city, leaving those who used to work for NATO with little choice but to hide and hope help will come to them.
This is the room where we are hiding.
Around the city, an unknown number of families with links to the West are trapped. Many, like this former British interpreter, have small children with them and are terrified of being discovered.
We are so scared. We scared that if the process stops or if the British forces just withdraw from Afghanistan, it will be very hard for us to leave.
ITV News footage of British passport holders locked out of the safety of the airport met with this blunt response from the government today, which says it must security vet everyone coming here.
People on the UK no-fly list have tried to access a flight to the UK, and that poses a real threat to our national security. So, those scenes are desperate. I have every sympathy for UK passport holders who are despairing in the crowd. We're getting through people at best speed, but the safety of troops and our responsibility to do the necessary checks means that we can't just open the gates and get everybody onto flights free for all.
What do you want? Save our family!
Today, former interpreters vented their frustration outside the Home Office at those they say have been left behind. This man's brother worked with British troops but hasn't been given permission to travel here.
A nightmare for them. We have got a contact number. They're only saying, just make your way. How can I make my way if the Taliban are not allowing me?
What are your fears for your brother if he's not rescued soon?
A lot, because right now he's standing in front of a Taliban who we have fought directly in the past 20 years. All these Afghans have stood shoulder to shoulder with the British soldiers. They have died. They've taken the bullets of the same enemy.
Many of these interpreters have left behind family members whose lives are now on the line. Some themselves worked for NATO and are facing an increasingly perilous situation in Afghanistan.
Time is running out. The air bridge will soon close, and there are fears the Taliban will then hunt down and kill former British interpreters who they still regard as the enemy. Dan Rivers, ITV News.
We'll go live to our global security editor, Rohit Kachru, who's in Washington in just a moment. But first to our political reporter, Shihab Khan, who is in Downing Street. And Shihab, from the British government's point of view, this couldn't be more urgent, could it?
Absolutely. There's been a lot of pressure on the Prime Minister and his government to make sure they get this right. Think back to that House of Commons debate just last week. His own backbenchers were very critical of the way this has been handled so far. Now, when you think about those evacuation flights, the deadline for that is the 31st of August. That's the date the US troops are set to be withdrawn. That's because they provide the security in that region. Now, sources inside Number 10 have been telling me for some time that not only are they hoping to do evacuations beyond that date, but they've drawn up some plans to do so. But that is contingent on US troops staying there for a few extra days at the very least. That's why tomorrow at the G7 talks which are taking place, those are talks between leaders of 7 of the world's most powerful nations, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson will be pushing his US counterpart Joe Biden to stay for longer. On those talks, on that agenda, there will also be discussions about financial aid for the region, aid that can be given to refugees, as well as discussions on how to best deal with the Taliban moving forward.
And Rohit, the pressure now on President Biden as well. And we know that the Taliban are opposed to any extension to foreign forces staying in Afghanistan.
Well, and there's probably more private consenters among the G7 nations than those that public pressure suggests. In fact, last week, President Biden said he may well have to extend the US presence beyond the end of the month, but he doesn't want to, and nor does the Taliban. It said today quite clearly that it would consider that to be a clear violation. What it didn't say is what it might do next. And so, as the US approaches this deadline, it's faced with these 2 threats. Firstly, from ISIS, of an attack within the airport compound. Secondly, from the Taliban, about withdrawing its relative cooperation with US troops on the ground. Today, the Pentagon said that it would consider the views of its allies ahead of this G7 meeting tomorrow. It also has to consider the views of the Taliban too, which has the power to do a great deal of harm, not only to its operations, but of course to the Afghan people who are trying to escape.
All right, Rohit in Washington, Shihad Downing Street, thank you both. So move on to other news now. New figures emerged today of a marked jump in COVID cases in English hospitals. The number of infected hospital patients topped 6,000 for the first time in more than 5 months. Royal Science editor Tom Clark joins me now. So, Tom, do these numbers suggest COVID is on the march again?
I mean, I think a lot of us, we've been trying to have a break over the summer, haven't we? Maybe forget about our cares and certainly forget about COVID. It definitely hasn't forgotten about us, however. Cases have been rising very, very slowly for a while now, and that's feeding through now into hospitalisations. They're nothing near where they were back in January, 34,000 people in hospital back then, but cases are going up, and that's particularly concerning now as schools go back in a couple of weeks. The government's urging young people to come forward and get vaccinations to try and take the heat out of that. But it's showing that we are still seeing quite a lot of transmission of the virus despite vaccination. Big questions about how bad things might get in terms of cases and hospitalisations and what the pressures on the NHS are going to be this winter.
All right, something to think about, isn't it, Tom? Thank you. Later in the programme, the clampdown on rip-off holiday COVID tests, plus countdown to the Paralympics in Japan as COVID cases rise there, and a return to normal at the Palace. Those stories and more after the break. Welcome back. The government has been criticised for doing too little, too late to stop cowboy firms trying to rip off holidaymakers with hidden COVID test charges. 82 private providers have been warned by the Health Secretary about charging much more than their prices quoted on a government website. Sergio Carrier reports.
Going abroad this summer means paying for COVID tests. How much depends on which company you choose. And many holidaymakers jetting off today from Gatwick told us they felt ripped off.
We've got our flights really cheap, but the expense comes with the test, really.
Yeah, the testing costs more than the flights.
It's the same operation. It's the same, the cost doesn't change from one provider to another. So I don't understand why there are such, huge differences in costing.
How many tests you need will depend on whether you're arriving from a green or amber country and your vaccination status. The government website has a list of private companies offering such tests, ranging from £20 to £358. But the Department of Health's own review found the lowest prices were misleading, and it announced a clampdown.
So while this change is welcome, it is about 6 months overdue. And the truth is, in that period, many people will have been ripped off because they followed a link on the .gov website.
There are around 400 such companies listed on the government's website. 82 of them, that's 18%, are being given a 2-strike warning. Fix your price or you'll be removed. 57 are already being removed because they no longer exist or don't provide these tests. We went to one testing laboratory on the government list. Its boss told us £20 tests aren't practical or achievable.
We have now 120 call centre agents. We have staff here in this laboratory, more than 50, working 24-hour shifts, for example, overnight. And to do that well, do it responsibly, and also be able to reinvest back into British life sciences, you have to actually have a price which works and isn't just a rock-bottom number.
The government will now also carry out regular spot checks. Many believe all this should have happened months ago. Sejal Karia, ITV News.
The Gogglebox star Mary Cook has died in hospital at the age of 92.
I've never been on a tasting, have you?
Yeah, loads of them, yeah. Don't try all the beers and the wines.
Oh, no.
Well, Mary, seen here on the left, joined the Channel 4 programme in 2016 alongside her friend Marina Wingrove. The show's producers said Mary will be sorely missed by the entire Gogglebox family, cast and crew. And the Sex Pistols' Johnny Rotten has lost a High Court battle against 2 of his former bandmates. The lead singer, whose real name is John Lydon, failed to stop their songs being used in a television drama being made about the former punk band. Mr. Lydon said the decision smacked of slave labour, but the judge said the singer had no power to override a majority vote among the group. After Britain's successes at the Tokyo Olympics, Team GB is preparing to take part in tomorrow's opening ceremony for the Paralympic Games. Well, Britain's flag bearers were named today as swimmer Ellie Simmonds and archer John Stubbs. But as our Paralympic athletes prepare to go for gold, COVID infections in Japan reached 20,000 new cases a day. Our Asia correspondent Debbie Edward reports.
There were waves, peace signs, smiles and sheer joy as Japan's Paralympians led the final day of the torch relay. All the debates leading up to these games dissolved in their pleasure at taking part. The chef de mission of Paralympics GB was given a small-scale but enthusiastic welcome by her Japanese hosts at the Kawasaki Stadium. She told us she is in awe of how the team has prepared in the prevailing pandemic.
I think what has been standout has been the adaptability, the agility, the innovation, the resilience, the determination from both athletes and their support teams.
Leading out the team at tomorrow night's opening ceremony will be 2 of its top medal hopefuls. Ellie Simmonds will be swimming in her 4th Games. She was just 13 when she competed in Beijing. John Stubbs is also a Paralympic veteran, going for another gold in archery.
They were absolutely delighted. I don't think they had any idea.
In Tokyo, as the Olympic rings have made way for the Paralympic symbol, protests against the events have continued.
No, Paralympics.
The city has been recording record cases almost every day, despite still being in a state of emergency. Dr. Iwata thinks the Paralympics should have been cancelled.
Now people are very worried about the surge of infections. Now, do people go back to the euphoric status again from like a back and forth kind of things? You know, the Olympic Games and the COVID-19, then again Paralympic? Maybe not. People became more sober and not having a feeling of enjoying the Paralympic game, which I feel very sorry for the Paralympic athletes.
They may commence amid a sobering situation in Tokyo, but we found a Games superfan in the city who helped lift the mood.
People cannot go together, cannot watch the event. I'm sorry for that, and for all the people of the world, that we can see it in the television.
Britain's Paralympians will be kept in a competitive bubble, striving for greatness with families and fans cheering on from afar. Debbie Edward, ITV News.
And finally, with impeccable timing to keep the Olympic theme going, Changing the Guard at Buckingham Palace paid tribute to Britain's Olympians today. For the first time since the start of the pandemic, this historic ceremony was on show in public again. And as Mark McQuillan reports, the band of the Coldstream Guards obliged with a medley of Olympic tunes.
It is a long-held tradition, but one that hasn't been carried out for some 18 months. So it was little surprise plenty were keen to witness the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace from whichever vantage point they could secure. Not since early last year has this journey been taken. Halted to try and avoid large crowds gathering during lockdown, it is now back, spreading joy and striking an upbeat tone. Songs like Spandau Ballet's Gold played to recognise our Olympians' success in Tokyo and lift the spirits of those soaking up this spectacle once again after a long wait.
It was a fantastic ceremony to watch. Yeah, we've really enjoyed it, haven't we?
I thought the music was good and I liked when we walked to Buckingham Palace.
Pretty cool. I got a chance to see them doing the inspection in the back there in the back by the barracks. So that was really nice. It was exciting.
The band of the Coldstream Guards continued with their musical theme, recognising Team GB's stars who'd seized their moment this summer, whilst the guardsmen and musicians made the most of their own spell in the spotlight today. Another step towards more events returning with crowds over the coming months, but few perhaps steeped in tradition as much as this one. Mark McQuillan, ITV News.
Oh, some kind of normality returns, and that is all for now. Charlene is here with news at 10, but from me and all the team here, bye-bye.